John and his girlfriend Sophie were excited for their 7-day cruise to the Caribbean. They had saved up for months, excited to relax on a luxury ship with endless activities and beautiful views. But as the days passed, John began to notice a strange man watching them from the lower decks. A man who didn't seem to belong there. It was their 3rd day at sea. John and Sophie had spent the morning lounging by the pool, sipping tropical drinks, and enjoying the sun. The ship was massive, and they hadn't even explored half of it yet. After lunch, they decided to check out some of the quieter areas, away from the bustling main decks. They wandered through the upper floors, stopping in at the casino for a few minutes before making their way to the ship's promenade. The views were incredible, with endless ocean stretching out to the horizon. Sophie loved the luxury of it all, the calm of being far from land, and the joy of having no real responsibilities for the week. As they descended to the lower decks, the atmosphere changed. Fewer people walked these hallways, and the lighting seemed dimmer. The noise of the crowds and music from the bars faded away, replaced by the soft hum of the ship's engines. That's when John noticed him for the first time. At the far end of the hallway, standing near a door labeled "Staff Only," was a man. His clothes were tattered and stained, a stark contrast to the neatly dressed passengers and uniformed staff. He looked older, with unkempt hair and sunken eyes, watching them intently as they walked by. John felt a chill run down his spine. He slowed his pace, glancing at Sophie, who seemed unaware of the man's presence. "Hey, did you see that guy?" John asked, his voice low. Sophie glanced back. "What guy?" John frowned. "That guy at the end of the hall. He was just standing there, staring at us." Sophie shrugged. "Probably just a crew member. Let's go check out the lounge." John didn't argue, but something about the man felt off. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Over the next few days, John saw the man again. Once in a dimly lit corridor near the ship's laundry area, and another time near the back of the ship where passengers rarely ventured. Each time, the man seemed to appear out of nowhere, always standing in the shadows, always watching. John tried to ignore it, but his anxiety grew. On the 5th day, as they were heading back to their cabin after a late dinner, they decided to take a less crowded route through one of the lower decks. As they walked through a deserted hallway, John's heart sank. The man was there again, standing at the far end of the corridor, partially hidden in the dim light. This time, John could see him more clearly. The man's clothes were frayed and dirty, and his face was gaunt, with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to bore into John's soul. There was something deeply unsettling about him, something that made John's instincts scream for him to get away. "Let's take the stairs," John whispered to Sophie, gripping her arm tightly. Sophie followed his gaze and finally saw the man. Her smile faltered. "John, that's weird. I've never seen him before." They quickened their pace, moving toward the staircase. John glanced back, his heart racing. The man had stepped out of the shadows and was walking toward them, slowly but deliberately. His footsteps echoed down the empty hall, sending chills up John's spine. They reached the stairs and hurried up to their deck, their breath coming in short gasps. By the time they reached their cabin, John's hands were trembling. He slammed the door shut and locked it, his chest tight with fear. Sophie was pale. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," John muttered, pacing the room. "But he's been following us. I've seen him a few times now, and it's always on the lower decks. He doesn't belong here." Sophie tried to calm him down, but John couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Who was that man? Why was he following them? The next morning, John decided to talk to one of the ship's crew. He described the man in detail, expecting the crew member to brush it off, but instead, the woman's face grew serious. "You shouldn't be down on those lower decks," she said quietly. "That area is for staff only. There are storage rooms, places that passengers aren't supposed to go." "But we weren't in the staff areas," John protested. "We were just walking through the hallways." The crew member hesitated, then glanced around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "There have been rumors about a stowaway on this ship." We've been trying to find him for days, but he disappears before security can reach him. If you see him again, you need to report it immediately." John's blood ran cold. The man wasn't supposed to be on the ship. He wasn't part of the crew or a passenger. He was living on the ship illegally, hiding in the shadows, watching them. That night, John couldn't sleep. Every creak of the ship, every muffled footstep in the hallway outside their cabin made his heart race. He imagined the man lurking just beyond their door, waiting for them to let their guard down. The next morning, they went straight to guest services and asked to change cabins. They moved to a room on a higher deck, away from the lower levels where John had seen the man. But even after they switched rooms, John couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. On the final night of the cruise, as they stood on the deck watching the sunset, John felt a presence behind him. He turned slowly and saw the man again, standing at the far end of the deck, watching them. His eyes were cold, empty, and unblinking. John's heart pounded in his chest. He grabbed Sophie's hand and pulled her away, not saying a word. They spent the rest of the evening in their cabin, with the door locked and the lights on. When they finally disembarked the next day, John felt a sense of relief. But the memory of the man stayed with him, haunting him long after they left the ship. He couldn't stop wondering who the man was, or what he had been planning. Julie and her family had been looking forward to their cruise for months. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway, with sun, swimming, and relaxation. But their vacation took a disturbing turn when they discovered a locked door on their cabin's balcony that wasn't supposed to be there. It was their first night on the ship, and Julie and her family had just returned to their cabin after dinner. Their suite was beautiful, with a spacious balcony that looked out over the open sea. After the kids fell asleep, Julie and her husband, Mark, decided to enjoy a glass of wine on the balcony. As they stepped outside, Julie noticed something strange. There was a small door built into the side of the balcony, just a few feet from where they were sitting. It was old, rusted, and had no visible handle. She hadn't noticed it before, and the more she looked at it, the more unsettling it seemed. "Did you see this earlier?" Julie asked Mark, pointing to the door. Mark shook his head. "No, I didn't even notice it when we came in." Curious, Julie tried to open it, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked tight. They assumed it led to a maintenance area and decided not to think much of it. But that night, Julie woke up to a strange noise, metal scraping against metal. She lay still, listening intently. The sound was faint, but steady, like someone trying to open the locked door on their balcony. Julie nudged Mark awake. "Do you hear that?" Mark listened, his expression growing concerned. The scraping continued for a few more seconds before stopping abruptly. They both got out of bed and stepped onto the balcony, but the door was still shut tight and the sea below was calm. Nothing seemed out of place. Over the next few nights, the strange noises persisted. Sometimes it was the sound of scraping, other times it was soft knocking. They reported it to the ship's staff, but when maintenance checked the door, they found no issues. One night, Julie awoke to the sound of whispered voices coming from the balcony. She held her breath, terrified. The voices were muffled, but she could hear them clearly through the glass door. She reached for Mark, shaking him awake. He listened, too, his face pale. Without thinking, Mark grabbed a flashlight and stormed out onto the balcony. But again, no one was there, and the strange door remained locked. In the morning, Julie demanded answers. When she confronted the ship's guest services about the door, their response was vague and unsettling. They admitted that the door led to a part of the ship that was no longer in use, an old utility area that hadn't been accessed in years. "But we've been hearing noises coming from it every night," Julie insisted. "Voices, scraping." The staff offered no explanation, simply assuring her that the door was secure. But Julie wasn't convinced. That night, unable to sleep, she stood on the balcony, staring at the locked door. The sounds didn't come, but she felt uneasy, like something was just behind that door, waiting. Greg, an experienced sailor, thought nothing could shake him on the open sea. He had been on countless cruises, enjoying the vastness of the ocean and the quiet solitude of the deck late at night. But one evening, as a storm rolled in, Greg witnessed something disturbing that left him questioning everything. Greg had been sailing for years. He loved the ocean, the way it stretched endlessly in every direction, the sound of the waves crashing against the hull, the sense of peace it brought him. This cruise was no different. It was his 5th in 3 years, and he was looking forward to spending a week at sea, relaxing and enjoying the quiet solitude of the ship. On the 4th night of the cruise, a storm began to brew on the horizon. Greg stood on the upper deck, watching the dark clouds roll in. Most of the passengers had retreated to their cabins or the indoor lounges, but Greg liked the storms. They reminded him of the power of the ocean, the unpredictability of nature. The wind picked up, whipping across the deck and sending sprays of salt water into the air. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the turbulent waves below. Greg leaned against the railing, watching the storm approach, when something caught his eye. At first, he thought it was debris floating in the water, but as the lightning flashed again, Greg saw it more clearly. A small boat, barely afloat, bobbing in the rough waters. It was old and damaged, with pieces of the hull missing. It looked as though it had been out there for years, forgotten and abandoned. Greg's heart quickened. He squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The boat wasn't from their ship. He was sure of that. It wasn't one of the lifeboats, and there hadn't been any distress calls that day. As far as he knew, they were in the middle of nowhere, far from any other vessels. He scanned the deck for crew members, but no one was around. The wind howled, drowning out any sound. Greg turned his attention back to the boat, and his blood ran cold. There was someone, or something, clinging to the side of the boat. In the next flash of lightning, Greg saw it clearly. A figure, barely visible in the darkness, was holding onto the boat, their head bobbing above the water. The waves crashed around them, threatening to pull them under at any moment. Greg's stomach twisted in fear. He grabbed the nearest phone and dialed the bridge, reporting what he had seen. The crew thanked him and assured him they would investigate, but their tone was calm, almost dismissive. Minutes passed and Greg continued to watch the storm, his eyes fixed on the boat. The figure was still there, struggling to stay afloat as the waves battered them. But the crew never came. No one else seemed to notice the boat or the figure. As the storm grew worse, the boat drifted further away, disappearing into the darkness. Greg strained his eyes, but he could no longer see the figure. The wind howled, and rain began to pour down in sheets, obscuring his view of the sea. Greg stayed on the deck for hours, waiting for the crew to respond, waiting for some sign that they had found the boat. But no one came. The storm raged on, and eventually, Greg returned to his cabin, his heart heavy with dread. The next morning, Greg approached one of the crew members and asked about the boat. The man looked at him strangely. "There was no boat," he said. "We checked the area. You must have been mistaken. The storm can play tricks on your eyes." Greg was sure of what he had seen. The boat. The figure, clinging to it. But no one else seemed concerned. For the rest of the cruise, Greg couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He returned to the upper deck every night, staring out at the ocean, hoping to see the boat again, hoping for some explanation. But the sea remained empty. When the cruise finally ended, Greg left the ship with a heavy heart. He couldn't forget the figure he had seen, struggling to stay afloat in the storm. He couldn't forget the feeling that he had witnessed something he wasn't supposed to see, something that would never be explained. Thanks for watching the video. We hope you enjoyed the journey. If you loved the twists and turns, don't forget to hit the like button and share the stories with your friends. Make sure to subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss out on our next thrilling tale, because there's always a new mystery or adventure just around the corner. Until next time, keep imagining, keep exploring, and remember, nothing is ever quite what it seems.